I've always believed that the worst dangers in the woods aren't the ones that jump out at you. They're the ones you convince yourself aren't real. The ones you talk yourself out of noticing because acknowledging them means confronting something you're not ready to face. And that belief, more than anything else, is what almost got me killed in North Carolina. My name is Caleb Mercer. I'm 42 years old, born and raised in eastern Tennessee, and I've spent most of my adult life roaming the southeastern U.S. in an aging Volkswagen Westfalia I rebuilt with my own hands. It's noisy, the engine hiccups in the mornings, and the cabinets rattle like loose teeth on gravel roads. But that van has been the only place I've ever felt at home. After my divorce, it became the place where I learned to breathe again, but it was also the place where I learned how thin the line between peace and danger really is. The story I'm about to tell happened 3 years ago, deep in the Pisgah National Forest of North Carolina, specifically an old campground people online warned others not to stay at after dark. Most of the warnings were vague: strange activity, odd noises at night, someone messing with campsites, missing gear, nothing supernatural. Nothing dramatic, just unsettling. But I've always had this stubborn streak, this belief that if I can't see the threat directly, then it's probably nothing. That logic has gotten me through plenty of uncomfortable nights, but not this one. I arrived at the campground late in the afternoon on a Wednesday, when the shadows were already stretching long between the trees. The road leading in was narrow and winding, with thick rhododendron brushing the sides of my van like fingers dragging across metal. The air was cooler than I expected for early fall, and there was this smell: wet earth, faint mildew, and something sharp underneath like rust. Not blood, just metal, but it stuck with me. The campground itself was quiet, too quiet. I remember cutting the engine and hearing everything go still like the forest was holding its breath. There were 9 designated sites, each spaced far apart. Only one other RV was there, a white Class C parked near the entrance, older model, no signs of anyone outside, no chairs, no firewood, no movement, just this blank, silent box sitting there like it had been left behind. I picked a site near the creek. The water moved slow, barely audible, more like a whisper than a flow. I set up my small awning, got a fire going, made coffee even though it was late. I always liked having something warm in my hands when I'm figuring out a place. And it didn't take long before I felt it. A kind of pressure, not physical, emotional. Like the woods were studying me, trying to decide whether I belonged or not. There was no wind, but the trees creaked every few minutes, as if shifting under their own weight. Every sound felt intentional. Still, nothing I could point at and say, this is why I shouldn't be here. Around sunset, I walked up the gravel drive to see if the other RV had any signs of life. I told myself it was practical. If someone else was camping here alone on a Wednesday, I might as well say hello. Safety in numbers, but the closer I got, the more wrong the situation felt. The RV had no plates. The windows were covered with reflective insulation panels, taped from the inside. There were footprints around the dirt by the door, deep, messy ones, like someone pacing, only one set. I knocked. Not hard. Just enough to test the silence. Nothing. I waited 30 seconds. Knocked again. Still nothing. I told myself the person was asleep or out hiking or in town. But even then, I knew. Something about that vehicle felt watched. Not empty. Not occupied. Watched. I walked back to my van with a tight, crawling feeling in my chest. I didn't like that I'd knocked. I didn't like that whoever might be inside knew I had. By the time night settled in, the temperature dropped fast. The fire crackled low. My breath fogged. I didn't feel like cooking, so I heated a can of stew on the stove and sat inside the van, reading. That's when I heard the first sound. A soft click. Not a twig snapping, not an animal stepping. A human sound, 2 pieces of metal tapping together. I looked out through the windshield, but everything outside was a wash of black and faint orange from the fire. I held still, listened harder. Click, 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 rhythmic, slow, measured. I stood and slid open the side window an inch. The clicking stopped immediately, not faded, not paused, stopped, like whoever or whatever was making it realize I was listening. I waited. The silence thickened, pressing against the van walls. Eventually, when I heard nothing else, I told myself it was just the metal on the awning shifting from the cold. I didn't fully believe that, but denial is a powerful survival mechanism. It lets you stay calm when you shouldn't. Around 11, I decided to turn in. I locked both doors, pulled the curtains shut, and set my phone on the shelf above my head. The forest had gone dead quiet now, not even insects. Silence in nature always means something, either weather or presence. And the air didn't feel like weather. I slept lightly, half dreaming, half listening. And it must have been around 2 in the morning when I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my van. Slow, deliberate, heavy enough to be human, gravel shifting, the kind of sound you don't mistake for an animal. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I lay there staring at the ceiling, heart hammering in my throat, feeling the weight of every step as it circled the van. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Whoever it was moved with intention, listening between each step, studying. They stopped by the sliding door. I couldn't see anything with the curtains drawn, but I could feel them there, close enough that if they wanted to open the door, the only thing stopping them was the lock. My mind raced through every possibility. A lost hiker, a ranger, a thief, the owner of the other RV, but none of those explanations fit the way they moved. This wasn't someone approaching for help or conversation. This was someone who already knew I was here and wanted to know more. The footsteps moved again, this time toward the rear of the van. Slowly, patiently, like they were mapping weak points. I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, but the moment I lifted it, the footsteps stopped again, as if the person sensed the shift of my weight inside. I froze. A full minute passed, then another. Finally, the footsteps retreated, but not toward the road, not toward another campsite. They drifted instead into the trees, away from the firelight, into darkness, and then disappeared completely. I stayed awake until sunrise, every nerve in my body locked tight, listening, waiting for the footsteps to return, for a knock on the door, for the metallic clicking to start again. But none of that happened. When the sky finally brightened to that faint pre-dawn gray, I slid out of the sleeping bag, unlocked the front door, and stepped outside. My breath came out in white bursts. The air smelled different now, still metallic, but sharper, like something disturbed the ground nearby. I walked slowly around the van. What I saw turned my stomach. Footprints, deep ones, one set, leading from the tree line to every door and window of my van, stopping at each one, pausing, then circling. And then this was the worst part. Returning to the woods, directly in the direction of the abandoned-looking RV at the entrance, but there were no footprints coming from that RV, only going to it, as if whoever walked around my van in the middle of the night hadn't arrived from the road, but had been waiting in those woods long before I ever got there, waiting for someone alone, waiting for someone like me. And even then, standing there alone in the cold, I still tried to rationalize it. Maybe a hunter, maybe a hiker who lost their tent, maybe someone confused, maybe anything except what my instincts were screaming. This person wasn't lost. They were looking for something. They were watching, and they weren't done. I kept staring at those footprints as though they might rearrange themselves into something harmless if I looked long enough. But the truth was carved clearly into the dirt. Someone had circled my van with purpose, with patience, and with absolutely no concern about being seen. That kind of confidence only comes from someone who has done it before. My first instinct was to leave, pack everything, get in the van, and drive until the sun was overhead. But some stubborn part of me needed answers, because leaving without understanding what had happened felt like admitting that the danger was bigger than I could handle. And I've lived my whole life convincing myself that I can handle anything. So instead of starting the engine, I walked toward the other RV. The air felt heavier with every step. The closer I got, the more the forest seemed to quiet around me, like it was listening for what I would do next. The white RV looked unchanged from the night before. No movement inside, no sign that anyone had stepped out. But knowing what I knew now, the stillness wasn't just eerie. It felt staged. I approached from the rear, careful not to step on the softer patches of dirt where new tracks might be visible. As I walked around to the passenger side, something caught my eye. A faint imprint in the mud, fresh, sharp-edged, the tread pattern identical to the footprints around my van. They led to the door of the RV and then vanished beneath it. Someone had gone inside. Recently. I stood there, muscles tight, breath held, fighting the creeping realization that whoever came to my campsite during the night wasn't just wandering the forest. They were living, hiding in that RV. I knocked. Not because I expected an answer, but because something in me needed to break the silence before it swallowed me whole. "Hello?" My voice sounded thinner than I expected. "You all right in there?" Nothing. I knocked again, harder. The stillness after the second knock was even worse. Like the RV absorbed the sound instead of echoing it. I stepped back, one foot, then another. My pulse thudded in my ears. I could feel eyes on me. Not the forest's, human eyes, from behind that insulation-covered window. I forced myself to walk away, not run, and headed back to my campsite. But I didn't go to the van. I walked straight past it toward the creek, toward a break in the trees where I could think without feeling watched. The water was barely moving, a thin ribbon of cold slipping through stones like it was trying not to make noise. I crouched down, splashed my face, felt the sting of mountain water against my skin. It grounded me just long enough to breathe. That's when I heard the whistle. Soft. 2 notes, coming from behind me. I froze, not because of the whistle itself, but because I recognized the intent behind it. It wasn't a tune, it wasn't a bird, it was a signal, a test to see if I'd react. I didn't turn around, I kept my eyes on the water and waited. A second whistle, same 2 notes. Closer. I stood slowly, hands loose at my sides, heart pounding so loud I could feel it in my teeth. I turned my head just enough to see movement through the tree line, a shadow shifting between the trunks, low to the ground, then rising. A man stepped out, or at least I think he was a man. He was tall, lean, wearing a heavy jacket with the hood pulled up even though the sun was rising. His face was mostly shadowed, but his posture told me everything. He wasn't lost. He wasn't confused. He was assessing me the same way someone might assess a stray dog, measuring whether I was worth dealing with. "Morning," he said. His voice was rough, like someone who didn't use it often. I swallowed. "You staying up at the other RV?" He tilted his head. The hood shifted, but I still couldn't see his eyes. "You shouldn't be here," he said, not as a threat, as a statement of fact. My stomach tightened. "Why's that?" He didn't answer. Instead, he looked past me, toward my van, toward the site. His jaw flexed slightly, the only visible movement under the hood. "You alone?" he asked. Every instinct in me screamed to lie, to say yes or no, whichever he wasn't expecting. But something about the way he asked made me realize he already knew the answer, so I didn't respond. He stepped closer. Not fast, not aggressive, just close enough that I could smell the mildew on his jacket and the metallic tang on his breath. Same metallic scent I'd noticed when I arrived. He smiled, barely, a twitch at the corner of his mouth. "You should pack up," he said quietly, "before it gets dark again." The way he said again made my skin crawl. He turned and walked back toward the trees, not toward the RV, not toward the road, just straight into the forest like he lived there. I stayed still until his footsteps faded entirely. Then I rushed back to my van, locking the doors the second I climbed inside. My hands shook as I started throwing everything into drawers and cabinets. I didn't care about organization. I just needed to leave. But when I reached for the ignition, something caught my eye, something tucked under the windshield wiper. A folded piece of paper. My heart dropped into my stomach. I opened the door slowly, eyes scanning the tree line, grabbed the paper, and ducked back inside. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. There was only one sentence written in shaky, uneven letters. "He watches who stays." No name. No signature. No explanation. I stared at the words, trying to understand. Was this from the man I just met? Was it a warning? A threat? A game? I didn't have time to figure it out. Because as I read the note a second time, a chill ran through me, one colder than the creek water. The ink wasn't fully dry. meaning someone put it there minutes ago, meaning someone had approached my van while I was talking to the hooded man, meaning someone else was watching us both. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I turned the key, but the engine didn't start. It sputtered, choked, then died completely. I tried again. Nothing. The silence that followed felt suffocating. I leaned my forehead against the wheel, cursing under my breath, trying to steady my thoughts. My van never failed to start, not once in the 7 years since I rebuilt the engine. Something was wrong, something mechanical, something intentional. I stepped out and lifted the rear hatch. The engine compartment smelled different, familiar, but out of place. A chemical smell, something residual, like solvent or cleaner. My fuel line was loose, not worn, not cracked, loosened. Deliberately. I stood there, staring at it, feeling the cold realization crawl up my spine. Someone had been under my van. Someone had sabotaged it while I slept, or while I walked to the creek. Either way, they wanted me stuck here. They wanted time. My breathing grew shallow. The trees around me looked different now, not like forest, but like walls. Then I heard it, that same metallic click I'd heard last night, not from the awning, not from the woods. This time, it came from behind the white RV at the entrance. I straightened slowly, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The hooded man said I shouldn't be here. The note said someone watches who stays. And the footsteps last night, slow, deliberate circling, didn't feel random anymore. Someone wanted me isolated. Someone wanted me afraid. Someone wanted me immobile. And now, they had exactly what they wanted. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just stood there beside the open engine hatch, hands hovering above the loosened fuel line, listening to the faint metallic clicking echoing from behind that white RV. Each click was spaced too evenly to be random. It had that rhythm again, a deliberate testing pattern, like someone was letting me know they were still there, still watching. My first instinct was to run into the woods. But where would I go? The nearest road was miles back down a narrow path, and the forest out here didn't feel like a place where you could disappear. It felt like a place where someone else already had, so instead I forced myself to breathe and to think, calmly, methodically, the way I'd taught myself during long years of solitude. Fear amplifies danger, but panic invites it. That was something I learned the hard way after my divorce, when every quiet moment felt like a threat. I recognize the feeling now, creeping at the edges of my mind. The narrowing vision, the impulse to flee, the urge to believe any thought that promised safety. I shut the engine hatch and locked it. My hands were shaking, but the moment the latch clicked into place, I felt a thin thread of control return. If someone had sabotaged my van, they had done it quietly, carefully. That meant they didn't want confrontation. Not yet. That gave me time, seconds, minutes, maybe more, to fix what they'd done. I grabbed my tool bag from the cabinet, stepped around to the rear of the van, and crouched down. The morning light was still weak, filtered through the dense trees. The cold from the ground soaked through my jeans, but I ignored it and inspected the fuel system again. The clamp wasn't just loose. It had been turned deliberately to the point where the line would disconnect with the slightest vibration. Another mile down the gravel road and the van would have stalled. Far from help, far from any cell signal. I would have had to walk out. And walking out meant exposure, vulnerability. Someone would have all the time they needed. They wanted isolation. They wanted me stranded. And now they had me exactly where they wanted. I tightened the clamp, wiped the residue from the line, double-checked the connections. Then I climbed in the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine coughed, shuddered, then caught. The sound filled me with a surge of relief so strong it almost hurt. Not because I was safe yet, but because I had a way out, a chance. But before I shifted into gear, I looked again toward the white RV. The metallic clicking had stopped. The forest was completely still. Too still, like someone was holding their breath. I remembered the man in the hood, his voice low, unsteady, but sincere in a way that didn't feel malicious. "You shouldn't be here." Those words hadn't been a threat. They'd been a warning. So who was he afraid of? I put the van in drive and eased forward, slowly, carefully. I didn't want to draw attention, but I also needed to get out of that campsite as quickly as possible. When I reached the narrow gravel road that led back toward the entrance, the trees felt closer together than they had the day before, like they'd grown overnight, closing in. The air felt thicker, heavier. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting movement. Halfway down the road, I saw something that made me slam on the brakes. There were tire tracks across the gravel, fresh ones, deep and uneven, veering from side to side, like whoever drove through had been swerving or fighting for control. They weren't mine. They pointed into the campground. Someone had come in during the night. I followed the tracks with my eyes. They curved around a bend and vanished into the thicker part of the forest. They didn't lead to a campsite. They didn't lead to the creek. They led to a narrow, unmarked trail most people wouldn't notice. A private trail, used by someone who knew the area, someone who knew how to get in and out without being seen. Suddenly, the hooded man's behavior made a different kind of sense. He hadn't walked out of the woods randomly. He'd come from somewhere, from someone. And he wasn't alone out there. My heartbeat quickened. I kept driving, gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. The moment the entrance came into view, every muscle in my body locked. The white RV door was open, just slightly, maybe an inch, but it was open. It had been sealed tight the night before, taped from the inside. Someone had forced it, or someone had left. I slowed the van to a crawl. My breath fogged the windshield. A thin curtain of cold air leaked through the vents. I rolled the window down an inch, listening. Nothing. No birds, no rustling leaves, no footsteps. I couldn't just drive past without looking, not because I was curious, but because some part of me needed to know if I was leaving someone behind, someone trapped, someone hurt. Even if it was foolish, even if it put me at risk, I couldn't shake the feeling that the note hadn't been meant as a threat. It had been meant as a plea. I parked the van, left the engine running, and stepped out. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get back inside and drive until the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror. But I didn't. I walked toward the white RV, each step slow and deliberate. The door creaked when I nudged it. Inside, the air was cold, colder than outside. The insulated panels on the windows trapped the temperature like a fridge. I stepped in cautiously. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Stale air, mildew, and something else. Human, but faint. Sweat soaked into fabric, fear soaked into silence. The place was stripped bare. No bedding, no food, no personal items. Just an empty shell. Except for the floor. There were marks. Short, parallel grooves scratched into the linoleum like someone had dragged metal across it. Over and over, in the same spot. The grooves formed a semicircle around where someone would stand facing the door like someone had been waiting, watching, listening. I felt a chill run down my spine. I backed out slowly, eyes scanning every corner. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. The silence felt unnatural. When I stepped outside again, I saw him. The hooded man stood at the edge of the tree line, watching me. No expression, no movement. But something was different now. He wasn't assessing me. He wasn't warning me. He was afraid. He lifted his hand, not to wave, not to beckon, but to point. Directly behind me, I turned. There, on the side of the white RV, scratched into the paint in long, uneven strokes, were 3 words, "Don't look back." I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I sprinted to my van, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. The engine was still running. I floored the gas. Gravel shot out from under the tires. The van lurched forward so hard I nearly hit the wheel with my forehead. As I sped down the narrow dirt road, I resisted the urge to look in the mirror. I didn't want to see what he meant. I didn't want confirmation that someone or something was stepping out of the woods behind me. All I knew was that the hooded man had pointed in terror, not threat. And those words on the RV weren't a message to scare me. They were a warning from someone who didn't get away in time. I drove until the trees thinned and the first sliver of the highway came into view. But even then, even with daylight breaking across the mountains, the urge to look in the rearview mirror gnawed at me, scraped at me, whispered that something was there. I gripped the wheel tighter. I kept my eyes forward. and I didn't look back. It's the color of rusted metal, or maybe it was the silence, the kind that feels earned, ancient, older than any road you'll ever drive. But every time I thought I'd had enough of chasing solitude in my old Volkswagen-based RV, every time I promised myself I'd camp somewhere easier, somewhere with trees or cell service or neighbors within shouting distance, I always came back. And every time, the desert felt just a little more like it was studying me. My name's Leon Parker. I'm 42. And if there's one thing you should know about me, it's that I don't scare easily. Or at least, that's what I believed for most of my life. I grew up in small towns, lived through storms that took down roofs, worked security jobs where people screamed in my face at 2 a.m. Fear was something I thought I'd aged out of. But Arizona, especially the remote parts of it, has a way of peeling you back to whatever you were before you convinced the world you were tough. The trip that changed everything happened last year, on a stretch of land not far from the Mogollon Rim, a place where the cliffs drop off without warning, and the wind seems to carry voices that can't decide whether they're warnings or invitations. I'd parked at a dispersed site, not a campground, not a place marked on any app, just a patch of hard earth framed by junipers and sandstone. I liked it that way. No hookups, no signs, just space. But the truth was, I didn't choose that site only for solitude. I chose it because of something I'd overheard weeks earlier at a small RV supply store in Holbrook. An older man, sunburned deep into leather, had told the cashier that a string of campers had packed up fast from the rim, leaving sites in the middle of the night without a trace of trouble. No weather, no wildlife activity, no reason at all. He said they'd all reported the same thing. Something was wrong with the quiet. People laugh at stuff like that, but I don't. Not anymore. I pulled in late afternoon. The temperature hung around 80, dry and clean, the kind of heat that feels more like light than warmth. My RV's engine clicked as it cooled, echoing into the emptiness around me. No other campers, no cars, not even a distant dust trail from an ATV. Just the desert, flat, pale, cracked, and the rim in the distance like a shadow with its own pulse. I stepped out, stretched, and took a long breath of the desert air. It smelled faintly metallic, which wasn't unusual this far from town. But there was something else, something I couldn't name. Not decay, not vegetation, just sharp. A smell like the air right before a lie is told, before something breaks. I shook it off. First nights always mess with your senses. As the sun slipped lower, the desert shifted. Colors darkened, shapes turned vague. The wind died so fast it felt unnatural, like someone had hit a switch. And with that stillness, the quiet arrived. Not peaceful, not calm, just absolute. Too absolute. If you've never camped in a place like that, you might think silence is comforting. It isn't. Not when it's heavy. Not when it feels like something is holding its breath. Not when you can hear your own pulse in your teeth. I tried to distract myself, made dinner, checked my gear, walked a few circles around the RV, but every step seemed too loud, each crunch of gravel sharp enough to feel like a disturbance. The quiet wasn't just present, it was defensive, territorial. When the sun fully dipped behind the horizon, the temperature dropped fast. I climbed into the RV, shut the door, and sat at the small table with my old notebook, the one where I jot down thoughts from the road. I wrote a few sentences, but my hand kept pausing, hovering. My mind felt jumpy, alert, like it was waiting for something to happen. And then, a tap, just one, on the outside of the RV, soft, too soft for an animal, too specific to the wind, a fingertip tap right behind my left ear. I sat still listening. The quiet pressed in again, thicker than before, as if it were listening too. My rational mind kicked in. Desert temperature changes can shift panels, metal contracts, sounds happen. I knew all that, but that tap didn't feel random. It felt aimed. A few seconds later, another tap, same spot, a second fingertip. My heart picked up, slow but heavy. I set the notebook down and stood, trying not to breathe too loudly. The windows were tinted from the outside, but from the inside, I could see the shape of the desert in broken pieces through each one. Nothing moved. I reached for the handle of the side door but stopped myself. Opening the door would only confirm what I already feared, that I didn't actually want to know what was out there. I waited. 1 minute, 2, 5. Then came the footsteps. Light. Measured. Not animal. Not scrambling or dragging. Human. Walking around the RV. The sound was dry, gravel crunching under deliberate weight, slowly circling. A voice in my head whispered something I didn't want to hear. Who walks this far from the road in the dark? I backed away from the door, but every step I took felt too slow. My mind started replaying every story I'd heard from hikers and boondockers. Stories about people who vanished, about strangers who wandered campsites, claiming they were lost but wouldn't leave even after being offered help. People who looked normal until they didn't. The footsteps paused near the rear window. Silence. Then, a third tap. This time higher, closer to where I knew my bed was bolted against the wall. I felt something cold crawl up the back of my neck. A thought I didn't want. They're mapping out where you are inside. I reached slowly toward the drawer under the sink where I kept a flashlight and a small folding knife, not because I expected to fight, but because holding something felt like the only thing that would keep me grounded. I clicked the flashlight on. The beam cut through the RV harshly, bouncing off cabinets, making shadows sharp and deep. The quiet was so complete now I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I tried to steady my breathing. Then, something scraped along the back of the RV. Not a tap, not a knock, a slow scrape, metal on metal. I knew exactly what that sound meant, because every RV owner knows it. Someone was dragging something, maybe a hand, maybe a tool, across the outer panel. That's not curiosity. That's not someone asking for help. That's someone testing. My chest tightened. I felt a tremor in my hands, one I couldn't stop. I stepped toward the front, crouched below the window line, trying not to silhouette myself. The scraping stopped. More footsteps, this time moving toward the driver's side. I felt myself swallowing hard. My mouth was dry. My thoughts scrambled between denial, probably just a lost hiker, and fear. No hiker circles an RV silently at night. Then, without warning, a shadow passed across the front windshield. Just a shape. Tall. Still. Watching. Every instinct inside me, every piece of survival intuition I'd ever ignored or rationalized, finally snapped awake. Something was very, very wrong. And I wasn't alone out there. The shadow didn't move. It just stayed there, fixed against the windshield like it was studying the shape of my RV, determining the lines of my world from the outside. The flashlight in my hand felt heavier, useless, like a toy I'd grabbed in a panic rather than anything that could actually help me. My throat tightened. I had the urge to duck further down, but I forced myself to stay still. Movement mattered right now. Even the smallest shift might give away my exact position. The shadow leaned slightly, just enough for me to see that it was a person. Shoulders uneven, posture stiff. The kind of silhouette that didn't look right. Not in the way someone naturally stands, but in the way someone stands when they're listening for something. The RV metal popped softly as it cooled, and the shadow flinched like it had been startled. Then it relaxed again, returning to its previous stillness. I finally moved, slow enough to keep the floor from creaking. I crawled toward the bunk area so I could grab my phone. No bars, not even one, just a blank signal icon in the corner that made my stomach drop further. Out here, I knew reception could be spotty, but I checked earlier, there had been 2 bars. That meant the signal didn't drop. Something blocked it. Or someone. I turned the phone to airplane mode, then back. Nothing. The shadow outside shifted, this time taking one slow step backward. The desert was too quiet. Even a single footstep felt like it echoed. I moved back toward the driver's seat area, crouching low. My breathing picked up again, shallow, uneven, and I fought the instinct to wipe sweat from my brow. I didn't want any sudden movement, not even inside. I reached for the keys hanging beside the steering column. They jingled. Barely, but enough. The shadow snapped sharply toward the sound. I froze, keys in hand. The figure leaned in toward the windshield, and though the tint prevented any clear view, I could feel deep in my chest that its face was inches from the glass. My heart thudded loud and fast. Then, a whisper. Not from inside, outside, but somehow it cut through the quiet. It wasn't a word. It was a breath, a long exhale, like someone steadying themselves or preparing. I backed away step by slow step, forcing myself to think, really think, through the panic. If I started the engine, I might scare them off, or I might provoke whatever this was into doing something worse. I didn't know which way the risk leaned, and that uncertainty dug knives into my nerves. The shadow suddenly turned and walked around the front of the RV. Fast, confident, like it had made a decision I wouldn't like. I didn't think. I grabbed the keys, slid into the driver's seat, and turned the ignition. The engine didn't start, just a grind, a stuttering cough. My blood went cold. It had never done that before. Not once. The RV wasn't new, but it was reliable, solid. I tried again, heart pounding. Another cough, another failure. Footsteps approached again, faster this time. I locked the doors out of instinct, even though I wasn't sure they'd hold if someone really wanted in. The locks clicked sharply. Too sharply, like they cut through the night. The footsteps paused, then sprinted, right toward the driver's door. I fumbled for the headlight switch, flipping it on. The beams lit up a swirl of dust, and then a figure darting out of range. Just a blur of dark clothing and movement. Not an animal, not a hallucination, a person. I didn't wait for thought to catch up with fear. I yanked the gear shift into neutral and turned the ignition again, pumping the gas as if that old trick would somehow coax life back into the engine. It didn't. But something else happened. The entire RV shook. Not violently, just a subtle, deliberate jolt, like someone had grabbed the back ladder and pulled. Testing strength, testing stability. I knew what that meant. I'd heard too many stories. People breaking into RVs didn't start by smashing windows. They looked for weak points, ladder mounts, rear storage doors, vents, determining the entry point. I stood up, gripping the flashlight so hard my hand hurt. For a split second, I thought about confronting whoever was out there, opening the door, shining the beam right in their face, shouting until the shock of human resistance broke whatever intention they had. But another part of me, the part that had lived through bad nights in rough neighborhoods, the part that understood danger, whispered sharply, "Do not open that door." I stepped backward, keeping the flashlight aimed at the ceiling. If they looked in through the windows, maybe they wouldn't see exactly where I was. Another jolt shook the RV. Harder. Then another. My stomach tightened. They were checking every corner. I needed a plan. There were two things out here in my favor: distance and unpredictability. Whoever this was didn't know what I had inside, didn't know if I was armed, didn't know if I was calling for help. I crouched low and moved toward the back hatch, one of those small emergency exits that you never want to use but always check anyway. I unlocked it silently. The footsteps moved again, this time closer, slower, right outside the rear panel. The metal flexed softly under pressure, like someone pressing their palm flat against it. I held my breath. Then came a sound I will never forget, a soft, careful inhale. Right behind the wall, like they were smelling the air inside, my skin crawled. I felt the kind of dread that doesn't burst suddenly, it blooms. Slow and cold. I pressed my hand flat against the emergency exit handle. If I opened it, I would step directly into the dark, into the desert, into open space with no cover, but staying inside meant being boxed in. Another test against the metal sound, this time near the window above my bed. Then, a whisper, clearer, still not words, but shaped like someone trying to vocalize something too quiet to hear. I knew then that whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They weren't lost, they weren't confused, they were interested. In me. In me. In the RV. In the fact that I was alone. I pushed the emergency exit just a fraction of an inch, enough for cold night air to slip through and numb my fingertips. I breathed in quietly, trying to steady myself. My lungs felt too tight. The desert smelled sharper now. That metallic edge was stronger, as if the entire landscape were holding its breath with me. Then, without warning, something knocked against the exit door. Not hard, gentle, almost polite. 3 soft taps. My muscles locked, my jaw clenched. I pressed the door shut again, silently but firmly. The footsteps backed away, slowly this time. then circled, around and around the RV. My pulse thudded so hard I thought it might be audible. I moved toward the front again, desperate to try the ignition once more. I twisted the key, closing my eyes as if that would change anything. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then it roared to life. The headlights flared, catching a shape right in their path. A person. Standing directly in front of the RV, arms at their sides, unmoving. But now I could see details I'd missed in the dark. Clothes coated in dust, hair uneven as if roughly cut, posture rigid like someone who'd forgotten how to relax into their own body. They didn't react to the engine, didn't flinch at the lights. They just stared. Not at me, at the windshield, at the silhouette of a man inside, at the prey. I slammed the RV into drive. The figure took one slow step backward, then another, then turned sharply and vanished into the desert, swallowed by darkness as if they'd been waiting for the light just to show me they existed. I didn't hesitate. I drove fast down the rough dirt road, the RV bouncing, dishes rattling, adrenaline twisting my stomach into knots. I didn't care about the suspension, didn't care about the dust cloud behind me. All I cared about was getting distance. Real distance. The road stretched ahead, narrow and dim, but I didn't stop. Not for miles. Only when I reached a wider service road did I finally pull over, shaking so badly I had to brace a hand against the steering wheel just to breathe. I glanced in the mirror. Nothing behind me but darkness, but something inside me wouldn't calm. Because what I'd seen wasn't random. And the more I replayed it in my mind, the more one truth settled in like a shadow that didn't belong to this world. That person hadn't come from the road. They'd come from the desert. And they'd known I was there long before I knew anything was wrong. I stayed there on the service road for a long time, engine idling, hands locked on the wheel as if letting go would undo the miles I'd put between myself and that silent figure. The desert outside my windows was still black and endless, but it felt different now. Less empty, more aware. Like the darkness itself had eyelids and they were open. I forced myself to breathe, slow and steady, even though each inhale felt thin. I knew I needed to get all the way to pavement, real pavement, before I stopped again. Just a few miles more. I tried to tell myself that whatever I'd seen was just someone living rough, someone disturbed or desperate, that people wander the backcountry for their own reasons. But deep down, I already knew better. What I had seen wasn't chaos or panic or someone searching blindly for help. It was intent. Purpose. I put the RV in drive and kept going. The road ahead brightened as the headlights swept across each turn, and after what felt like half an hour but might have only been 10 minutes, the gravel gave way to blacktop. My shoulders dropped, some tension loosening just from the smoothness beneath the tires. I spotted a pull-off near a closed ranger station, just a small patch of gravel beside a locked metal gate. I pulled in and parked facing the highway. If anyone approached, I'd see them coming. And there was no way someone could sneak up quietly on asphalt, or at least, that's what I needed to believe. I killed the engine, but left the keys in the ignition. The silence that followed wasn't like before. This one had the familiar hum of distant cars, the kind of white noise that felt normal, human. But even with that, the memory of the earlier quiet clung to me, like something that had soaked into my skin and refused to dry. I checked my phone again. 2 bars. Enough to call. Enough to tell someone what happened. I stared at the screen, thumb hovering over the dial. Who was I going to call? The ranger station was closed. The sheriff's office would ask for a description I barely had. A person standing in the dark. Wasn't much to give them. And honestly, I didn't want to explain it to anyone yet. Not until I processed it myself. So I set the phone down, locked the doors again, and finally let myself sit back. But rest didn't come. My mind replayed that moment when the figure stood in the headlights. How they'd stared not with the shock of someone caught or the fear of someone hunted, but with recognition, like they were memorizing me. The desert outside the windshield glowed faintly under a half moon, now rising behind scattered clouds. I told myself that moonlight made the world safer, clearer, but it also made every movement visible, every shadow longer. I needed to calm down. I reached behind the seat for my thermos, poured lukewarm water into a small metal cup, and took a sip. The familiarity helped, the normalcy of it. But even that simple action reminded me how exposed I'd been earlier. Something didn't add up, though. Something simple, obvious, a detail I hadn't processed until now. That figure didn't have a flashlight, no lantern, no headlamp, no pack, no water, no sign of travel, and there was no light out there. None. No reflected glow, no phone screen, nothing. How had they moved through the desert in that kind of darkness without stumbling? I kept replaying it. Their steps were measured, precise, not cautious, not feeling their way forward. Their posture didn't sway like someone navigating blind terrain. They moved like they knew exactly where each rock, each rise, each ledge was. I felt the skin tighten along my arms. People don't move like that in pitch black unless they've walked that land for a very long time, or unless they're not looking for where they are going. They're looking for you. I swallowed hard, pressing a palm to my chest as if that could quiet the pounding underneath. A shaky breath escaped me. I needed sleep, but there was no way that was happening. The adrenaline still pulsed through me in waves, long after I'd reached safety. I leaned forward, resting my head against folded arms on the steering wheel. At some point, minutes or maybe an hour, I must have drifted into a half-conscious blur, not quite asleep, not awake, lost somewhere in the haze of exhaustion. Because when I lifted my head again, the first thing I registered wasn't the desert or the cold or even the stillness. It was movement, in the mirror, a flicker, quick, not close, but not far enough that it could be ignored. My breath caught. I blinked hard, trying to clear the fog from my thoughts. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it. I stared at the mirror again. Nothing, just moonlight on asphalt. But then, another flicker. Farther down the road this time, like something slipping out of sight behind a cluster of rocks. The cold that washed through me wasn't like the earlier fear. This one was deeper, settling in my gut with a quiet finality. They had followed me. Not immediately, not by running behind the RV, but eventually, somehow. The stretch of road ahead curved left, disappearing behind a low ridge. Whatever had moved was somewhere along that bend, out of view now, but close enough that the instinct in my chest screamed one clear message: leave. Now. I turned the key. The engine started instantly this time, no hesitation, no sputter. My hands trembled as I shifted into drive. I kept my eyes on the highway, refusing to look in the mirror again. The RV rolled forward slowly at first, my pulse pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. But as the tires hit the road, I pressed harder on the gas, building speed until the gravel pull-off vanished behind me. The night blurred past. Mile after mile. I didn't stop until the sky had started to lighten at the edges, and I reached a diner outside Payson. The kind of place that smells like hot oil and old coffee. The kind of place where no one looks twice at a dusty RV pulling in at dawn. I parked, just sat there for a few minutes, breathing unevenly, staring at the faded open sign flickering behind grimy glass, and for the first time since the desert, I felt like maybe, I wasn't being watched. Inside, a waitress poured me coffee without a word. The heat of the cup steadied my hands. The chatter of early morning truckers grounded me in a way silence never could. But even surrounded by people, something inside me was still twisted tight. I kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see a face pressed against the glass, or a silhouette standing near my RV. Nothing. Still, the unease didn't leave. That figure in the desert wasn't random. I could feel it as surely as I felt the heat from my coffee. Something connected them to that land, to that silence, something that didn't rely on light or sound or even the logic most people live by. While I sat there, I realized something else, something that chilled me more than any moment in the night. I hadn't seen their face. Not once. Not a reflection. Not a glimpse in the headlights. Not even an outline. Just the shape of a body, a shadow wearing human proportions. And yet, even without a face, I felt seen. Deeply. Uncomfortably. As if that person hadn't needed eyes to every inch of me, my movements, my fear, my hesitation. The waitress asked if I needed anything else, but her voice sounded far away. I shook my head automatically. My mind was back on the desert, replaying the slow scrape along the RV's metal siding, the deliberate steps around the perimeter, the moment the headlights flared and the figure simply stood there, unbothered. Who or what moves like that? Someone unafraid of the dark. Someone who belongs to it. Someone who knows the land in ways that people who camp there for one night will never understand. And suddenly, everything clicked into place with a quiet, dreadful clarity. What I'd felt out there earlier, that wrongness in the quiet, that wasn't the desert reacting to me. It was the desert recognizing something that wasn't supposed to be there. That person wasn't from the road. They weren't from any campground. They weren't a drifter. They were a resident of that silence, a keeper of it. Maybe a warning wrapped in human shape, maybe something worse. Whatever they were, they'd marked me. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, the same way you know when someone has memorized your face, your voice, your presence. And Arizona felt different to me after that night. Not less beautiful, not less magnetic, but alive. Every ridge, every canyon, every hollow pocket of silent air. Alive in a way I couldn't explain. People always ask why I keep returning to Arizona, why I call it my obsession. They think it's the scenery or the solitude or some spiritual pull. But the truth is simpler. I keep going back because part of me needs to understand what I saw, needs to understand why I was the one they approached, needs to understand why the desert still feels like it's watching. And because a deeper part of me knows this, whatever walked around my RV that night, it wasn't finished with me. And the desert isn't a place you escape. It's a place that remembers. I always tell people that fear doesn't need a shape to be real. Sometimes it just needs a place. And West Virginia, especially its hollows, its forgotten roads, its thick Appalachian silence. That place knows how to build fear the way mountains know how to hold shadows. My name is Carter Hale. I'm 38 years old, born on the flatlands of Indiana, raised around cornfields and predictable horizons. The mountains were never home for me. Maybe that's why I kept going back to them, because some part of me believed fear was a teacher, one that only appeared when the ground under you rises, surrounds you, and swallows the sky. I traveled in a 1984 Volkswagen Westfalia that I rebuilt myself. White body, green stripe, rust tucked in the corners like old regrets. That van was my way of staying connected to something simpler, something honest. But the truth is, I was running from something I never talked about. The fact that for years I had ignored instincts that could have saved someone I loved. So now I listen to every instinct, every flicker of unease, as if the world whispered warnings meant only for me. When I crossed into West Virginia that October, the light was different, amber and heavy, as if the sun was tired. The leaves were halfway gone, rattling against bare branches in a wind that felt colder than it should. My plan was simple: explore a string of primitive RV-compatible campsites along an old Forest Service road outside Clay County. A friend had mentioned the views, the quiet, the remoteness. I didn't tell him that remoteness was the thing I wanted most. But the moment I turned onto that narrow gravel road, I felt it. The quiet unease that works its way into your ribs before anything actually happens. The road tightened between hills that rose like sleeping giants, thick with trees that leaned inward as if trying to listen. Every mile I drove deeper, the air got darker. Not the sky, the air. Like the space between the trees grew heavier, more compressed. I told myself it was the season. I told myself it was normal Appalachian quiet. But there's a difference between silence and being watched by something that knows how to stay quiet. I reached the campsite just before dusk. There wasn't much to it: a clearing carved into the slope of a hill, a fire ring made of old river stones, a picnic table coated with the thin black film of wet leaves. The place looked used, but not recently. The fire ring was cold. The footprints were faint, yet something about it felt tended to, as if someone had been there a week ago, or yesterday, or an hour before I arrived and slipped into the woods the moment they heard my engine. I shook it off. Fear loved to embellish. I parked the van so the sliding door faced the forest, the way I always did. I liked seeing what might approach. I liked believing I'd have time to react if something felt off. That night, the tension built in strange ways. It wasn't noise, it was the absence of it. No crickets, no distant coyotes, no leaves skittering, just a stillness so thick my ears strained for something to latch onto. Around 9, while heating canned soup on the portable stove, I heard the first sound of the night, a single knock, not on the van, not on the table, on a tree, a sharp, intentional tuck that echoed through the hollow with a human rhythm. One knock, pause, then 2 more, evenly spaced. At first, I assumed it was a branch falling or a woodpecker, but woodpeckers don't knock at night, and branches don't fall with perfect timing. I felt that old instinct rise in me, the one I had ignored years ago, the one tied to a night I still couldn't talk about without my hands shaking. Every bone in my body whispered, "Listen." I turned off the stove, slid open the Volkswagen door, and stepped out into the cold. My breath looked louder than the forest sounded. Nothing moved. But the knocking had direction. It came from the right side of the clearing, just beyond where the firelight would reach if I had lit a fire. Maybe 50 feet into the trees. A place where a person could stand unseen if they knew how to blend into darkness. I don't know how long I stood there, pretending I wasn't searching for silhouettes or eyes or a shape of anything that didn't belong. My chest felt tight, like the night wanted me to make the first move. Then, footsteps, not close, not threatening, but unmistakable, moved along the ridge above the campsite, slow, deliberate, as if someone was pacing, as if someone was deciding something. My internal conflict came fast. Do I trust that it's nothing, or do I trust the fear that's been right before? I backed into the van and shut the sliding door quietly, without the usual slam. A small thing, but it made the night feel heavier, as if my silence encouraged something else to come closer. I didn't sleep. Every sound, or lack of sound, pressed against my nerves. The knocking never repeated. The footsteps didn't return. But the dread stayed, expanding in the tight space of the van until the air felt thick enough to taste. Around 1 a.m., a cold smell drifted in through the cracked window, metallic, like wet iron, almost like blood, but sharper. A mineral scent that burned slightly at the back of the throat. It was so strong it made my eyes water. That smell meant something nearby, something that didn't belong in a forest. When dawn finally bled into the hollow, gray and weak, I stepped outside to see if anything had changed. At first, everything looked exactly how I left it, but then I saw them. Footprints, not boot prints, bare footprints, long, narrow, and angled, like someone walked on the outer edge of their feet. They circled the van once, then twice, then led into the woods. But that wasn't what made my stomach collapse. The footprints were smeared with red clay, the kind found near riverbeds miles away, the kind not found anywhere near that clearing. I tried to steady my breathing, but something inside me cracked open, an old guilt, an old instinct I had ignored the night someone close to me begged me to leave a place that didn't feel right. A night I stayed, believing logic mattered more than fear. A night that ended with flashing lights and a sheriff asking me questions I still hear when I close my eyes. So this time I listened. I packed fast, my hands shook. The van felt small, vulnerable. I didn't even bother cleaning up the stove or the loose gear. I just shoved everything inside. I didn't look into the woods. I didn't search for the footprint source. I didn't even breathe fully until the engine turned over and gave me a way out. But leaving wasn't as simple as it should have been. A mile down the forest road, I saw something that made me slow to a crawl. Not stop, just slow, because stopping felt dangerous. On the right side of the road, where the trees thinned, was a tree stump. Freshly cut, smooth, clean, but the surface wasn't bare. Carved into it, deep, calculated, was a single word. My last name. I didn't stop. I didn't take a picture. I didn't question how anyone could have known it. All I knew was that someone had been out there, someone who didn't walk normally, someone who knew how to carve letters into wood without waking the forest, someone who circled my van while I pretended instinct was just paranoia. By the time I reached the first patch of pavement, my panic had thinned enough to let me think again. But thinking didn't make anything easier. It just made one truth clearer. This wasn't a random encounter. Someone had chosen me, or followed me, or waited for me. And the farther I drove away, the more I realized something terrifying. I wasn't done with West Virginia, and West Virginia wasn't done with me. I've learned that fear doesn't always arrive with fangs or shadows or the kind of things people turn into campfire stories. Sometimes fear comes quietly, slowly, like a draft leaking through a cracked window. You don't see it at first, you just feel it. A shiver, a hesitation, a faint, almost embarrassing instinct telling you something is wrong. That's how this started, with a feeling, not a threat. My name is Evan, I'm 38, and I've been RV camping since I was in my 20s. I grew up in Nevada, worked odd jobs most of my life, and found the road later than most. Oregon had always been one of my favorite states. Serene, green, overwhelming in its own kind of quiet beauty. I had spent nights in Forest Service roads, dispersed sites, pull-offs where the smell of rain and moss hung so heavily it felt like stepping inside a cathedral built by something older than people. But this one was different. This was the trip that taught me how easily a beautiful place can turn hostile, not through monsters or ghosts, but through the parts of nature that shift when you aren't paying attention, through people who don't act the way people should, through your own instincts turning on you, whispering warnings you try to rationalize away. I had driven my white Volkswagen camper, an old Westphalia I'd rebuilt twice, up through southern Oregon, planning to spend a few nights near a lake I'd visited years before. It wasn't an official campground, just an open clearing off a forest road, the kind of place that existed mainly because a few hunters had flattened it out decades back. The first time I'd camped there, it felt peaceful, remote in a comforting way. That's why I went back. I thought I'd find that same stillness, that same sense of being tucked away from the rest of the world. When I pulled in that evening, the sun was already dropping behind the tree line. The whole clearing glowed gold through the dust my tires kicked up. It looked the same as I remembered, almost. The space felt narrower, as if the forest had crept a few steps closer over the years. The trees felt heavier somehow, leaning inward, branches angled deeper, casting longer shadows even before dusk fully settled. But I brushed it off. Places change. Light changes. Memory changes. I parked near the edge of the clearing, that with just enough distance between me and the tree line to feel comfortable. I always like having some buffer, open space behind me, trees in front of me. It's a habit. Something about knowing what's coming from the back, but letting the darkness exist in front of me where I can see it. That night, the quiet felt slightly off, and I know how that sounds. Quiet is quiet, right? But when you camp enough, you learn to hear layers in silence. Forests aren't truly still. There are insects, rustling branches, distant birds, cracking twigs, the occasional animal moving through brush. Even wind carries a pattern. But this place, the silence felt forced, like the forest was listening instead of living. I cooked a quick meal, did a short walk around the clearing with my flashlight out of habit, then climbed into the van to settle in. The moment I shut the sliding door, an unease crept into me. Not fear, just a heaviness behind my ribs, like my body knew something I didn't. It wasn't until the middle of the night that I woke up to the first sound, a single snap of a branch. Not big, not violent, just too deliberate. I sat up instantly. I'm a light sleeper when camping alone, and years on the road tuned me to wake at even the smallest changes. I listened. Nothing. Just the faint hum of my own breathing and the wind nudging against the van in irregular intervals. I tried to tell myself it was deer. Could have been anything. Branches fall, animals move, woods settle, but the sound had been close, too close, like someone had stepped on a dry twig just outside the van. I reached over, slid open the curtain a sliver. Pitch dark, my reflection stared back faintly in the glass. No movement, no flashlight beams, no crunching steps. Still, I didn't shake the feeling. Even after I lay back down, sleep wouldn't fully return. Every minute or so, I'd find myself pausing my breath to listen, waiting for the next sign that I wasn't alone out there, but nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I slipped back under. Morning should have made everything better. Usually does, but as soon as I stepped outside, I saw something wrong. Not dramatic, not horrifying, just wrong. The ground beside the passenger door had footprints, not boot prints, bare feet, small, narrow, maybe a teenager's size. And the strangest part, the tracks weren't leading to or away from the van. They were just standing prints, as if someone had been standing there, unmoving, facing my camper sometime during the night. My first reaction wasn't fear. It was confusion. Maybe tracks from before? Maybe someone else had camped here earlier in the week? Maybe rain had washed away the lighter prints around them, but the pattern wasn't faded. The edges were crisp, too crisp. They were fresh. I swallowed hard. I should have left then. Should have trusted that quiet voice telling me something was off. But I've always had this weakness. I rationalize things that scare me. Growing up, I learned early that being too jumpy got you laughed at, mocked, told you were being dramatic. So as an adult, I overcorrected, convincing myself that every strange detail had a perfectly logical explanation, and maybe this one did. Maybe someone wandered through barefoot last night. A hiker? A drifter? A kid from a nearby town messing around, but standing still in one place, right at my door. By late morning, I had mostly talked myself out of the unease. I made coffee, read for a while, and then decided to take a walk down to the lake, the same one I'd visited years before. The trail wasn't long, just a narrow path between the trees, descending slightly as the forest thickened. The deeper I walked, the more the air changed. Oregon forests are always cool, but this was cold. Clammy, the type of cold that clings to the inside of your clothes. And then there was the smell, not rotten, not foul, just old, like damp rope or fabric that had been left in a basement for too long. It hit me midway down the trail. Didn't belong. I stopped for a moment, taking in the strange stillness. The forest wasn't just quiet, it felt like it was holding its breath again. I pushed on. When I reached the lake, the sight of it eased something in me. The water was smooth, untouched, a mirror reflecting nothing but sky. But then I noticed another detail, one that brought that unease flooding back. There were fresh footprints in the mud, leading right to the water's edge. The same size, the same shape. Bare. Human. And again, no returning prints. I stared at them for a long time, trying to understand. Whoever made them either stepped into the water or something else happened. Something about that thought made my chest tighten. The rest of the day, I stayed near my van. I tried to read, tried to relax, tried to ignore the tension that knotted itself inside me tighter with every hour. But even in daylight, I kept glancing toward the tree line. My ears stayed alert. My mind kept replaying the shape of those footprints. I kept thinking, someone was out here last night. Someone walked up to my van, and they didn't want me to know they were here. By the time dusk settled in again, I felt the tension crawling up my spine all over again. The forest grew darker, faster than it should have. The air seemed heavier. Even the silence felt sharper, like it was listening again, leaning in, waiting. I told myself I'd leave in the morning, one more night, then I'd move on. No need to pack up in the dark and drive a forest road half blind. I wish I'd left then. That night, the knocking started. Not on the van, not on metal, on the ground. A slow rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on the earth beneath my window. The tapping didn't stop. It kept going. Slow, deliberate, spaced just far enough apart to make my pulse sync with it, like my body was being forced into its rhythm. I held my breath. I didn't move. I just listened. Every instinct inside me finally screamed the truth I had been denying for 2 days. Someone was out there, and they had been out there the whole time. I reached slowly for the switch on the small interior light, but my hand froze halfway. I didn't want whoever was outside to know I was awake. My breath felt loud, too loud. Even the soft scrape of my sleeve against the sleeping bag sounded like a warning flare. The tapping shifted. It moved from the ground to the side of the van, just one knock, gentle as if asking for permission to come in. That was when something inside me broke. All the rationalizations I had built collapsed in an instant. I grabbed my keys, slid quietly into the driver's seat, and turned the ignition so slowly it felt like I was moving through water. The moment the engine coughed awake, everything outside went silent. Then I heard footsteps. Finally, real, unmistakable footsteps running back toward the tree line. I didn't wait to see who or what they belonged to. I slammed the van into gear and tore out of that clearing, dirt spraying behind me as the forest swallowed my taillights. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station nearly 40 miles away. When I stepped out, my legs were shaking so violently I had to grip the door just to stay upright. The clerk asked if I was okay. I told him I thought someone was watching me at my campsite. He nodded slowly, too slowly, and said people had been reporting strange encounters in those woods for months. But no one ever found anything. No footprints, no camps, nothing. To this day, I still replay those knocks, those footprints, that cold, unnatural silence. And the truth is, I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. All I know is this. If your instincts tell you something is wrong out there in the dark, you listen. You leave. You don't wait for proof. Because sometimes the only thing standing between you and a nightmare you can't explain is leaving before it steps out of the trees. I've learned that silence can be the most dangerous sound in the world, especially when you're alone, tucked between the dark pines of Northern California, and there's nothing but your breath to remind you that you're still alive. My name is Evan. I'm 39, and I've spent more nights in an RV than I have inside any real home. I grew up drifting from place to place with a father who never stayed still, and somewhere along the way, that habit became my inheritance, along with the belief that solitude was safer than people, that the wilderness held fewer threats than the hearts of men. But last September, in a lonely campground off Highway 299, I found out how wrong I was. I had been on the road for nearly a week, leaving the blistering inland heat behind and following the winding rivers that cut through the Shasta Trinity Forest. I wasn't running from anything, not exactly, but I wasn't heading toward anything either. Life had felt heavy. I'd recently ended a long relationship, one I thought would last, and although I told friends I needed space, the truth was simpler. I didn't want to hear my own disappointment echo inside the walls of my apartment, so I chose the woods, where disappointment dissolves into the open air. When I arrived at Red Bluff Creek Campground, a small, unstaffed primitive site miles from the nearest town, I immediately felt something different in the air. Not ominous, just quiet in a way that seemed unfamiliar, like the forest had muffled itself. It was late afternoon. Sunlight filtered down in weak gold through the towering pines, dust drifting in the beams. There were only 3 marked sites, and 2 were empty. The third contained nothing but a rusted fire ring and a crumbling picnic table. I stepped out of my RV and listened. No voices, no highway noise, not even the distant crack of branches from animals moving about. It was as though the forest was holding itself still, observing me. Normally, that kind of quiet brings me peace, but that day it felt like stepping into a room where someone had just stopped talking. I shrugged it off, told myself I was projecting. After all, I was alone by choice, and for a while, everything felt exactly the way I wanted it. Peaceful, clean, untangled. I set up my small folding chair, lit my propane stove, and made dinner. The air smelled of red dirt and pine sap, sharp and grounding. When the sun dipped behind the hills, the temperature dropped with it, the shadows growing long and heavy across the ground. I watched the sky go indigo, then black. Not long after the dark settled in, though, the sounds started. At first it was subtle, a soft shuffle in the undergrowth. I assumed it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. But the steps were slow, deliberate, too heavy for something small and too hesitant for something confident. I leaned forward in my chair, listening more carefully. The footsteps stopped, then came again, a little closer. I stood and scanned the tree line, but my flashlight showed nothing but trunks and brush. I exhaled and tried to laugh at myself. Nights in the forest magnify everything. A squirrel can sound like a bear. A bear can sound like a person. And sometimes nothing at all can sound like something coming straight for you. Still, unease hung in the back of my mind like a faint hum. I locked the RV door when I finally went inside, more out of habit than fear. The air felt colder than the weather app predicted, as if a draft seeped in through the walls. I crawled into bed, pulled a wool blanket over myself, and waited for the comfort of sleep to take me. Instead, I heard it again, a soft crunch outside. Then another, slow. Testing the ground. I held my breath. There were maybe 5 seconds of silence before a new sound followed. A dull tap against the RV's side panel. Not a knock, more like something brushing or dragging. A branch, maybe. Or an animal brushing against the metal. I felt my stomach tighten. I tried to rationalize it. The wind had picked up. A tree limb was tapping the aluminum. No big deal. But the tapping came again, this time lower, near the wheel well, then another along the back corner. It wasn't the wind. The rhythm was too irregular. I turned off every light inside, even the small bathroom nightlight. I wanted to see out the windows without glare giving me away. I pressed my face gently to the side window and peered out, pitch black, the kind of black that feels thick. No shape, no movement, nothing. I stood there for a long time, listening. Minutes passed. The tapping didn't return. Eventually, the forest fell still again. Somewhere in that silence, I convinced myself everything was fine. I climbed back into bed, though my muscles remained tense, as if waiting for some cue I couldn't name. I stared at the ceiling until my eyelids grew heavy. When sleep finally came, it came all at once. I don't know how long I slept, but something woke me. A feeling first, like I had been watched even in my dreams, then a sound, not outside this time, inside. A faint, metallic click, the unmistakable sound of my RV's entry step creaking under weight. My eyes flew open. I froze, every muscle going rigid. I strained my hearing until my head pulsed with my own heartbeat. The seconds stretched thin. Another creak, slight, but real. Someone, or something, was standing on the step just outside the door. The locked door. My breath came shallow, and I remembered too late that I had left the porch light off. I slid out of bed without making a sound. My hands trembled as I reached toward the thin curtain covering the door window. I pulled it back a fraction of an inch. At first, all I saw was night. Then I saw the outline of a shape, not an animal. The silhouette was human, or close enough to human to turn my legs to stone. There was a figure standing inches from my door, unmoving, no flashlight, no gear, no visible face, just a dark shape in darker shadows. I felt panic rising, but with it came something far more complicated. Anger at myself. Because earlier, before sunset, I'd noticed something odd at the campground, something I dismissed because I wanted the solitude more than I wanted answers. Near the fire ring of the empty campsite, I'd seen footprints. Fresh ones. Deep heel marks, like someone had been standing still for a long time. I assumed they belonged to a camper who had left earlier that morning. But looking now at the figure outside my door, I knew better. Someone else had been here long before I arrived. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who had watched me set up camp. Someone who had waited until the world fell silent to get closer. I swallowed the panic rising in my throat. I needed to think. Carefully, quietly. I stepped back from the door, moving in tiny, controlled motions. I reached for my phone only to feel cold dread settle in my stomach. No signal. The nearest ranger station was miles away. No one knew I was out here. I had chosen isolation, and now isolation had chosen me. The figure outside shifted slightly. The step creaked again. I held my breath, thinking of every story I'd heard growing up about people disappearing in remote campgrounds, stories my father used to dismiss as fear-mongering. The forest is safer than people, he'd always say. Trees don't lie. But people could hide behind trees, and this person, whoever they were, had been hiding long enough to know my habits, my routine, my comfort with being alone. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt since childhood, the sense of being prey. I moved slowly toward the driver's seat, trying not to make the RV shift or groan. If I could get the engine started, maybe I could scare them off. Maybe I could leave before they tried the lock. My foot had barely touched the floor when there came a new sound, a sound that stopped me cold. The door handle moved. It rattled. Then again, harder. My lungs seized. My heartbeat hammered against my ribs like it was trying to escape. The handle jiggled a third time, this time with force. They were testing it, testing my last barrier. I stood frozen, gripping the wall for balance, staring at the door like it might burst inward at any moment. Every instinct screamed for me to move, to act, to fight or flee, but fear held me suspended in place. Another jolt to the handle, this one violent. Then, silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, the kind that meant the person outside wasn't leaving. They were waiting. Waiting for what? I didn't know. But every second of that waiting felt like it peeled another layer of safety away from me. And then, from just behind the door, barely audible, breathing, slow, measured, human, not an animal, not the wind, a person inches away listening for me the same way I was listening for them. And that was when I realized something I still wish I hadn't. They knew I was awake. The breathing outside my door was the quietest sound I'd ever heard, yet it hollowed me out from the inside. It was steady, slow, too intentional to be the breath of someone unaware or panicked. Whoever stood out there wasn't frightened. They were patient. They were listening. And I knew they could hear my breath too. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to make myself smaller, quieter, less alive. My thoughts scattered, sharp and irrational, then reorganized into something cold and focused. When fear gets deep enough, it stops thrashing. It becomes calculation. I knew I couldn't start the engine now. The ignition beep alone would betray my position, and the sound of the engine turning over, loud, mechanical, would take seconds. Too long. Plenty of time for the person outside to force their way in if they chose. My eyes darted across the RV interior. There weren't many options. No weapon beyond a small hatchet I kept in a drawer near the kitchenette. No back exit, only one door. And no windows big enough to climb out without making enough noise to alert the whole forest. I waited, gripping the counter with trembling hands. The breathing persisted. Slow inhale, long exhale, the kind of breathing someone uses when they're trying to decide something. Then another sound, a soft scrape along the door's outer panel, dragging downward. Not a hand, not a tool, something rougher. Fabric? A jacket sleeve? The edge of a bag? It moved deliberately, like the person was tracing the outline of the door, mapping it, testing it. I swallowed hard. Whoever they weren't surprised to find me here. They weren't reconsidering. If they weren't afraid of a light or a shout or a camera, nothing deterred them. They already understood the isolation. They chose it. For the first time in years, I wished desperately that someone else was camped nearby. I edged toward the driver's seat again, this time slower, careful to keep the RV from rocking. I crouched low, my knees brushing the vinyl floor, and reached for the key in the ignition. I paused. The breathing stopped. My fingers froze inches from the key. Seconds stretched. The forest outside remained silent. No wind, no animals, no footsteps. Then the doorknob shook, violently rattling the flimsy lock in its housing. I jerked back. The RV swayed slightly with my movement, bumping against its stabilizers. A mistake. A big one. Because the second the RV moved, the person outside reacted instantly. A hand slammed flat against the door. Hard. Then another. 2 palms. Pressed. Testing the strength. Testing me. I felt the vibration through the metal. Another shove. Stronger. My breath caught in my throat. I scrambled backward toward the bed, heart pounding so hard it felt like my ribs might crack. I grabbed the only thing I could find, a flashlight, and held it like a weapon, though I knew it wouldn't do much. Then, without warning, the pressure on the door released. Silence again. This time, however, the silence felt sharper, more purposeful. There was movement, but faint, like someone stepping off the RV's little metal step and onto the dirt. Then, footsteps. Slow, moving along the side of the RV. I followed them with my eyes, even though I couldn't see a thing. The sound of weight shifting, dry pine needles crunching softly under boots. They were circling, trying to find a window to look through, trying to peer inside. A shadow passed over the small side window above my sink. I saw it. Not a clear shape, but the suggestion of one blocking the faint glow of the moon. My breath hitched. The shadow lingered. They were watching me. I crouched lower, pressing myself against the cabinet beneath the sink, arms wrapped around my knees to quiet my shaking. My mind raced. Should I confront them? Yell? Turn on the lights suddenly and hope it scared them off? But some deeper instinct stopped me. Something primal. The person outside wasn't startled by light. They weren't startled by locked doors. They weren't startled by silence. They were following a script in their mind, one far ahead of mine, and confronting them might escalate things in the exact direction I feared. The footsteps moved again, slower this time, passing along the rear of the RV, toward the opposite side, toward the big bedroom window where the blinds were thinner, where my silhouette might be visible if I made even one wrong move. I crawled silently to the far corner and sat in the narrow space between the closet and the wall, hugging the shadows. The footsteps stopped, right outside that window. Then, so quietly I almost thought I imagined it, I heard another sound. A whisper, not words, not exactly, just a low, breathy murmur, like someone testing their voice after hours of not using it, or someone adjusting their breathing to match mine. I covered my mouth with my hand to keep from gasping. The whisper persisted, faint and rhythmic, like the person outside was repeating something only they could hear. I strained to make sense of it. Eventually I caught the pattern. A counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, over and over. Not louder, not light, not threateningly, just counting, as if marking time, as if waiting for something, as if deciding when. My skin crawled. Every instinct told me to run, but run where? Into the woods? Into the arms of the person who already moved silently enough to reach my RV without alerting me? Then the counting stopped abruptly. The footsteps moved again. Fast, purposeful, around the rear of the RV, toward the door. They knew I was moving. They knew I was panicking. They knew I was trapped. I backed into the closet corner until my shoulders pressed against the wood. Breathe. Stay quiet. Don't provoke. My heartbeat felt loud enough to hear outside. And then a metallic sound, different from before. The click of metal sliding into metal, the unmistakable sound of a tool sliding into the door's lock. They were picking it. I froze. Another click. A scrape. A soft twist. The lock jiggled. I bit down on the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. My hands trembled uncontrollably. The metal scraped again, more aggressively. The lock shifted. One more turn and the door would give. I forced myself to move before fear glued me in place forever. I crawled toward the front of the RV, keeping low, and reached under the passenger seat where I kept a small emergency horn, the kind used for boating. It wasn't a weapon, but it was loud as hell. If I waited, they'd break in. If I used it, maybe I'd buy seconds. Maybe I'd frighten them, or maybe I'd just provoke them. Another click, louder. The lock halfway turned. I made my choice. I pressed the horn's button. The sound exploded through the RV. Sharp, piercing, deafening. It blasted through the night like a flare, echoing through the trees, bouncing off the mountainsides. The person outside reacted instantly. Footsteps stumbled backward. Fast, then retreated. A quick, erratic crunch of pine needles tearing away from the door. Then, silence. I stayed crouched, shaking violently, horn still clutched in my hand, waiting. Seconds passed, then minutes. My ears rang, making it hard to distinguish real sound from phantom noise, but nothing came back. No footsteps, no breathing, no whispering. I didn't move. Not for a long time, not until the ringing in my ears dimmed and the forest air settled into absolute stillness once more. It was over, or so I thought. Because 15 minutes later, as the adrenaline finally began to ebb, just enough for my body to shake uncontrollably, my phone buzzed. A notification. Not a text. Not a call. A motion alert from the small battery-powered camera I kept mounted above the front door. A cheap, off-grid device that stored footage locally. The alert simply read, "Person detected, 1:42 a.m." My stomach dropped. I had never seen that message out here. Not once. The camera had captured something. Someone, and they had come back. I stared at the screen of my phone like it had betrayed me. 1:42 a.m. The timestamp burned into my vision. I should have felt relief that the horn had driven them off, but instead, The motion alert felt like proof that I had been only momentarily spared. The forest had exhaled, only for me to realize the predator had not left. Not really. I backed away from the phone, my breathing ragged. Every nerve in my body screamed that I was exposed. I didn't move toward the door. I didn't look outside. I didn't even flick the lights on. I crouched near the bed, holding my hatchet like a talisman, trying to calm my shaking hands. Rational thought had dissolved into raw instinct. Fight, flight, freeze. Freeze had lasted longer than I cared to admit, and now it was giving way to a desperate need to survive. I needed to leave. But the engine would give me away if they were still near. I didn't have a plan, not a proper one, just instinct, and a stubborn refusal to let this end badly. My eyes flicked to the side window. Tiny, thin, probably strong enough to hold a human weight, but not enough for me to climb out silently. The only path out was forward, past the door where the person had tested the lock, past the steps where the horn had driven them off, past the waiting shadows of the night. I thought of every mistake I'd made coming here alone. Every reassurance I had whispered to myself about solitude being safe. Every "I can handle this" I had repeated in the car, in the quiet towns along the highway, in the moments before the forest claimed its attention. And now, the reality had shifted. Solitude wasn't safe. It never had been. Not here. Not in a place where someone could exist without notice, where the stillness could hide intention, where the night itself seemed to watch and wait. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost meaning. I remained pressed in the corner, not daring to make sound, not daring to breathe too audibly. The hatchet felt cold in my hand, its weight grounding me, reminding me that if the world forced my hand, I could respond. But that knowledge was double-edged. Knowing I could respond didn't make the forest any less menacing. The person outside could have waited until I acted, counting the beats of my hesitation like a metronome, measuring my fear. By the faint light filtering through the blinds, I noticed small details I hadn't before. The RV's aluminum siding bore scratches, tiny marks along the rear corner near the bed window, a trace of mud on the step where the person had pressed against it. Someone had been here before, not recently. Before I arrived, the proof of premeditation, and I hadn't seen it because I didn't want to. Solitude makes you willful. Solitude makes you selective with fear. Solitude lets you pretend that the world outside your chosen silence doesn't exist. The forest outside remained quiet again, so quiet it was almost an insult, almost daring me to peek. I did, just slightly. The curtain trembled in my hand as I inched it aside, and the moon, pale and indifferent, revealed nothing. No silhouette, no movement, no sign of the person, only the forest, endless and black beyond the rim of the window. I convinced myself they had retreated, or perhaps they were watching from somewhere I couldn't see, somewhere hidden in the brush, lying in wait. My mind couldn't decide which was worse, the certainty of confrontation or the uncertainty of lurking threat. I waited, listening, waiting. Every tiny noise, a falling leaf, the scuttle of a rodent, the groan of the RV as it shifted, made my skin crawl. Hours passed. I don't know how long. Eventually, sleep came in tiny, fitful waves, never enough to fully close my eyes, never enough to convince me that I was alone. When dawn finally broke, the first rays of sunlight cutting through the pines like cold knives, I felt almost foolish for surviving the night. Almost, but not entirely. Because the forest didn't release me. Even with light, I felt its presence, its pressure, something invisible pressing, reminding me of the night's horrors. I didn't step outside until I had devised a plan. I fueled the RV, I checked my surroundings. Every instinct screamed caution. Every shadow, every bend in the dirt road, every gap between the trunks whispered the threat wasn't over. And I realized then the most dangerous lesson of all: the forest was never silent. You just couldn't hear the real predators until it was too late. By mid-morning, I drove slowly, eyes scanning every turn, every clearing. I kept the windows up, the doors locked, the horn close at hand. I didn't stop until I reached a small town with real people, neighbors, voices, laughter, ordinary mundanity I hadn't realized I craved. I parked the RV and went inside the first open diner I found. The smell of coffee, the chatter of regulars, even the clatter of dishes grounded me in reality. It was then I reviewed the footage from the camera. Not much. Grainy, night vision, black and white. But enough. The figure stood on the step, the dark silhouette of a man. Not running, not retreating, watching. Eyes almost glowing from the infrared. I had been the only movement he needed to observe. And then, like a shadow folding back into the night, he left frame. But I knew he hadn't gone far. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. I spent the rest of that day thinking, analyzing every decision, every hesitation, every choice I had made that had kept me alive, and every one that had almost ended me. And I understood something profound, something visceral. Camping alone in California, in the deep, remote forests, was an illusion of safety. The wilderness doesn't promise protection. It doesn't care who you are or how careful you think you've been. It only magnifies what is already there. The truths about your own fear, your own misjudgments, your own vulnerability. I never stayed in another primitive campground alone after that, not in California, not anywhere. I chose sites with people, with rangers, with neighbors who might be awake while I slept. I started carrying more than a hatchet and a horn. I added communication devices, backup plans, and an unflinching respect for the invisible threats that can inhabit quiet places. Even now, I remember the sound of that first tap on the RV's metal side, the slow, deliberate intrusion of presence into my solitude. I remember the counting outside the window, the patient, measured breathing, the scraping of a hand or tool testing a lock. And I remember the lesson that no amount of experience or preparation can fully eliminate fear. Because fear isn't just about the external threat. It's about the internal realization that, for once, your carefully constructed illusion of control has been stripped away. The night taught me about patience and perception, about the razor-thin line between safety and danger, and about how vulnerable we are when we believe the forest or any remote place is neutral. It is never neutral. It is an entity that mirrors the intent of those who inhabit it. If someone intends harm, the forest will hide them until you notice, until you hesitate, until you give them a moment to become the predator and you the prey. I tell this story not to scare for sport, but to warn, to awaken the respect for solitude, to honor the intelligence of the forest and the cunning of those who hide within it. The freedom of solo RV camping is intoxicating. The thrill of empty roads, star-filled skies, and distant rivers is seductive. But one night alone in a forest that doesn't sleep, and you might discover that the real danger isn't the trees, the dirt, or the dark. It's the shadow of human intention that lingers in every corner. That September night is etched into my memory as a lesson in vigilance, a lesson in humility, and a lesson that I hope anyone who chooses the solitude of a remote campground remembers before they convince themselves that they are alone, safe, untouchable, because the forest listens. The forest watches, and some shadows move with purpose, even in the deepest silence. I never forgot the counting, the whisper of a man in the dark measuring my presence, the way his patience became terror, and I never will. And sometimes when I drive along Highway 299, when the sun dips behind the mountains and the pines stretch long shadows across the road, I feel a prickle of memory. I feel the ghost of that night, not in the forest, not in the darkness, but in myself, in the tension, in the understanding that even the most prepared mind is prey to fear when alone and unaware. I learned to respect the silence, to anticipate the unknown, and to never ever camp alone in a place that hides more than it reveals. Not in California, not in any forest that whispers and waits. Not ever. Because the lesson of that night is simple, brutal, and unforgettable. Some dangers are quiet. Some dangers wait. And some dangers are patient enough to watch while you think you are safe until it is too late. I learned the hard way that the desert doesn't have to roar to be deadly. Sometimes it just waits, quiet as a held breath, watching how far you'll walk before you realize you were never the one in control. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 38 years old, a lifetime wanderer who thought he understood the rules of the road. I've camped everywhere from Oregon's moss-choked rainforests to the wind-lashed plateaus of Wyoming. I've slept through mountain storms, flash floods, electrical failures, breakdowns miles from cell service. I thought I had earned a kind of quiet confidence, a belief that nothing in nature truly meant me harm. You learn to adapt. You learn to respect the land. You learn to stay calm. Arizona taught me something different. Arizona taught me that the desert doesn't care whether you respect it or not. I was traveling in my Volkswagen camper, heading south from Flagstaff toward a remote patch of BLM land near the Mogollon Rim. Beautiful country, endless scrub, sandstone cliffs, and a silence so complete it felt physical. That was what drew me there. I'd been carrying around a lot of noise in my head lately, especially after losing my younger brother the year prior. He had always pushed me to keep traveling, to keep seeing places he never got to see. But somewhere along the way, travel stopped feeling like freedom and started feeling like running. I told myself the desert would clear my mind. It did the opposite. The road out to my campsite was a narrow, washboard track cutting through open land with juniper scattered like lost sentinels. Dust curled behind my van as I drove, painting the sunset into strange, copper-colored streaks. By the time I reached the site, just a small pull-through clearing with a fire ring and nothing else, the sun was dropping fast. The temperature plummeted in its usual desert way. Warm one moment, bone cold the next. I set up camp the same way I always did, nothing unusual. But even then, before anything truly happened, something didn't feel right. The stillness had weight to it, like the air itself was waiting for me to mess up. I shrugged it off. A long day on the road, an overactive mind. Grief I still hadn't learned how to hold without it tearing at me. As darkness settled, the desert stretched out in every direction, an ocean of black and silver, broken only by the faint whisper of wind through dry brush. No traffic noise. No planes overhead. No campfires on the horizon. Just me, alone. That should have been peaceful. It wasn't. I kept catching myself glancing toward the edges of camp, expecting something. I didn't know what. A coyote. A person. A shape in the dark. Nothing ever appeared, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that my presence had stirred something awake. I told myself the fear was just habit. After all, I'd been on edge since my brother died. Too many nights lying awake, cataloging every sound in the dark. Too many days trying to act like I was fine. But the desert doesn't care about your excuses. The desert listens. The desert notices. Around midnight, an unfamiliar noise jolted me awake. Not an animal call. Not the wind. More like movement. Slow. Careful. Deliberate. Gravel shifting under weight. I lay still, forcing my breath to stay quiet. In the darkness of the van, every creak felt amplified, like even my heartbeat was broadcasting my location. The sound stopped. Silence swelled again, so thick it pressed against my eardrums. I told myself it was probably an animal. Arizona has plenty. Foxes, coyotes, javelinas wandering close to campsites, hoping for scraps. I'd dealt with wildlife plenty of times. Nothing new. But the sound I heard, the cadence of it, felt wrong. Not 4 legs. 2. I stayed awake for over an hour listening. Nothing. Finally, exhaustion won. When morning came, the desert looked ordinary again. Nothing disturbed except a few tracks near the fire ring that I convinced myself had been there before. Still, something in my gut whispered the truth. They hadn't. I should have left then, packed up the van, turned around, and headed back to civilization. But people don't listen when danger whispers. They only listen when it screams. Instead, I drove deeper. I wanted to explore a slot canyon I'd marked on my map months before. A narrow, twisting vein carved into the sandstone. The kind of place that looks like it holds secrets older than language. The kind of place my brother would have loved. The drive took me 2 hours, bouncing over washouts and dodging boulders. By the time I parked near the canyon mouth, the early unease had faded into something almost like courage. Maybe I'd imagined everything. Maybe it was just grief twisting sound into menace. I hiked in slowly, running my fingers along the canyon walls. They were cool despite the rising heat, ridged with centuries of water erosion. Light fell in delicate beams through cracks above me, illuminating drifting particles of dust. I felt small, in a good way at first. Then the feeling shifted. The canyon narrowed the deeper I went, compressing the world into a corridor barely wide enough for my shoulders. The air thinned. Sound changed. My footsteps no longer echoed. They were swallowed. A wrongness settled in my chest, subtle but growing. I stopped walking. Ahead of me, the canyon twisted out of sight. Behind me, it did the same. For a moment, I couldn't tell which direction I'd come from. A strange, metallic taste coated my tongue. My heartbeat quickened. I pressed my palm to the wall for grounding, but the sandstone felt oddly warm. Too warm. That was the first moment I realized I wasn't supposed to be there. Not in some supernatural sense. Just pragmatically, logically. The canyon wasn't safe. Slot canyons are death traps if conditions shift even slightly. But my fear wasn't about flash floods. It wasn't about getting lost. It was the sensation, the absolute certainty that someone else was in the canyon with me. The air behind me shifted. A soft scuff of stone. My breath stilled in my throat. I turned. Nobody was there. The canyon was empty. Completely empty. I told myself to move, to get out before my nerves made the walls look like faces. But when I tried to walk, my legs hesitated, my body bracing for something I couldn't name. That was when I noticed it. A footprint. Half erased, but unmistakably human. And not mine. It pointed deeper into the canyon. A spike of dread shot through me. Why would someone be hiking this far in without gear? Without noise, without announcing themselves? And why did the print look fresh, so fresh it couldn't have been more than an hour old? I swallowed hard. Instinct screamed at me to leave. Logic backed it up. Every survival lesson I'd ever learned echoed the same warning. Don't follow danger deeper. Don't chase answers where the environment gives you none. I turned around, ready to head back toward the van. That's when I saw it. Another footprint, behind mine, fresh, new. I hadn't seen it when I entered, which meant someone had been following me. Quiet unease twisted into something sharper, something cold, something that reached under my ribs and squeezed. I didn't run. Not yet. Panic ruins judgment. Panic kills. But I walked fast, hands brushing the canyon walls, using every bit of light to guide me. My mind spiraled through possibilities. A lost hiker, a stranger, someone crossing the land the same way I was. None of those explanations felt right. Because whoever it was, they weren't calling out. They weren't asking for help. They were silent. Too silent. And they were close. The canyon opened slightly, allowing a slant of light to spill across the floor. I stepped into it and froze. More footprints. At least 3. Different depths. Different strides. They circled my own tracks. My skin crawled. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't wildlife. This wasn't imagination. Someone had been studying me. I stared at those footprints so long it felt like the canyon walls leaned closer just to watch me understand the danger I was in. My mouth went dry. A slow numbness crawled up my spine, the kind that comes not from fear alone but from recognition, an old instinct waking up, whispering that I'd already stayed too long. I backed away, careful, controlled, refusing to turn my back until I reached the next bend. The canyon narrowed again, stripping away what little light I had. My breaths echoed in shallow, rhythmic bursts, bouncing off stone in jittery patterns that made it sound like someone else was breathing with me. I kept moving. Step after step. Hand on the wall, eyes scanning for movement. For a while, nothing changed. Only the sound of my boots on packed sand, the brush of my palm against sandstone, the pulse in my ears mapping out every second I was still alive. Then, faint, something shifted in the canyon behind me. This time it wasn't a footstep, it was the air. A change in pressure, subtle but real, like someone large had moved through a tight space. The kind of movement you feel more than hear. The kind your body detects before your mind catches up. I didn't look back. Not because I was brave, because I knew that seeing something, anything, would destroy whatever thin line of composure I was clinging to. And if I panicked here, in a slot canyon, with only one way out, I was as good as dead. I kept my pace steady, but my chest tightened with each step. I could feel someone behind me. Feel it in the same way you can feel a storm coming in your bones. The canyon walls finally widened. Not much, just enough to let me breathe a little deeper. I recognized the scrape of rock I'd passed earlier, the faint sliver of sky I'd noticed on my way in. I was close, probably 10 minutes from the mouth of the canyon. My foot lifted for another step, and I froze. A new footprint, right in front of me, fresh. So fresh it looked like whoever made it had stepped there seconds before, except I had seen no one pass me. That was impossible. There was only one path, no side trails, no alternate exits, no way for someone to get ahead of me unless they'd been waiting. My throat constricted so violently I had to remind myself to breathe. The footprint faced toward me, toward the deeper canyon, not outward, not toward the exit, which meant someone had been standing right there on my way in, and I had walked past them without realizing it. Something in me broke then, part fear, part anger, part the raw, pulsing awareness of how close I'd come to the edge without knowing. I stepped backwards, slowly, instinctively putting distance between myself and that footprint. The air grew still again, heavy, expectant. Then, very quietly, stones shifted somewhere to my left. Not wind, not an animal, a person. My chest seized. I turned. The canyon wall looked the same as always, smooth, contoured orange and gold where the light hit. But something felt wrong, like a piece of the wall wasn't shaped the way it should be. A shadow that didn't match the angle of the sun. A darker seam slightly recessed into the stone, maybe a split, maybe a gap. I blinked, and the shape was gone. Not literally gone, but no longer distinct enough for my mind to separate it from the rock, like it had blended back into the canyon. I didn't stay to analyze it. My body moved on pure survival instinct. I turned and walked, fast, silent, trying not to stumble, keeping the canyon exit in my mind like a lifeline. That's when the breathing started. Soft at first, barely audible, not mine, a few feet behind me. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I wanted to run, but the canyon was too narrow. One bad step and I'd shatter my ankle. So I did the only thing I could. I kept walking, and the breathing followed, slow, deliberate, matching my pace, keeping distance but never losing ground. My vision blurred at the edges from fear, but the exit was close now. I could see the light brightening. Just a few more turns, a few more feet. The canyon widened a final time, opening into the blinding Arizona sun. I stepped out fast, and the breathing stopped. Silence slammed into me so hard I staggered. I spun around. Nothing emerged from the canyon. Nothing moved in the shadows. Nothing followed. But I knew what I'd heard. I knew what I'd felt. Someone had been there. I didn't wait to see if they were still watching. I sprinted to my van, the heat rippling around me in dizzying waves. My fingers fumbled the keys. I got inside, locked the doors, and sat there shaking while the engine idled hard beneath me. I didn't look back when I pulled away. Not once. Not even when I reached the main dirt road and sunlight turned the mirrors into bright, blind rectangles. I drove for nearly an hour before the panic loosened its grip enough for me to think clearly. I found a pull-off with cell service and stopped long enough to drink water and calm down. That's when I checked the outside of my van. Footprints. Human, circling it. There were 3 distinct sets, just like in the canyon. My stomach dropped, because the prints weren't just circling the van. Some led up to the windows, some to the back hatch. One pair stopped right at the driver's door. Someone had approached while I slept, stood inches from me, watched me in the dark. A cold realization washed over me, one that carved itself into my bones. They hadn't followed me into the canyon. I had followed them. It explained the silence, the watching, the deliberate patience. Whoever they were, they had been moving through that land long before I arrived. They knew the canyons, the hiding places, the vantage points. They knew how to move without sound, how to erase their presence until it was too late to notice. I started the van again, more determined than afraid now. Some fears become so real they burn themselves into clarity. I drove until the desert gave way to highway, and the highway gave way to towns and other people, and the hum of a world that made sense. By the time I reached a populated area, the sun was low and my nerves were stretched thin. I stopped at a gas station with bright fluorescent lights and security cameras. It felt safe enough to breathe again. Inside, the cashier glanced up and said, "You look like you saw a ghost, man." I didn't tell him the truth. I didn't tell him I wasn't sure the thing I saw was a person, or that maybe the desert shapes people differently out there, sharpens them, hides them, teaches them to move like shadows. I didn't tell him that the canyon still felt like it was inside my head, narrowing my thoughts, squeezing out everything except the memory of breathing that wasn't mine. I didn't even tell myself that I barely made it out. But I learned something that day, something I carry with me every time I camp alone. Danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it studies you, waits for you, matches your steps until you mistake its patience for your own safety. Arizona is beautiful. Arizona is quiet. Arizona is vast. But Arizona is dangerous. Not because of the heat, not because of the wildlife, not because of the terrain, but because sometimes out there in the open desert, you're not as alone as you think. And if you ever feel watched in the canyon, if you ever hear breathing that isn't yours, if you ever see footprints that weren't there before, leave immediately. Never make my deadly mistake. The night I learned what fear really feels like didn't start with a scream or a shadow or anything dramatic. It began with something softer, smaller. Just the feeling that the air around me wasn't mine to breathe. My name is Colton Meyer. I'm 37 years old, and I've been RV camping since before I could legally drive. I grew up in a small town outside Asheville, the kind of place where the mountains cradle everything you are and everything you try to escape. I left North Carolina in my 20s thinking the world would feel bigger, freer, safer. But somehow, the road always led me back. And last fall, I made the mistake of coming home in an RV big enough to carry my overconfidence right into the heart of a place I should have remembered not to trust. I came back for space, for quiet, for the wilderness that raised me. But I also came back because I'd burned myself out on life. Bad breakup, long hours, too many days pretending I wasn't drowning. I thought camping would reset me. I thought solitude would keep me honest. But solitude in North Carolina, it doesn't behave like solitude anywhere else. I parked my RV at a small, unofficial spot near Pisgah National Forest, a clearing I remembered from when I was a kid, just flat enough for a camper, just isolated enough to make you feel like you're the only person who's ever walked that ground. I told myself that was freedom. In truth, I think I was trying to disappear for a while. That first day was calm, quiet, cool, almost nostalgic. But the quiet wasn't the good kind. It wasn't the peaceful quiet that settles into your bones and slows your mind down. It was the kind of quiet that listens, the kind that knows more than you do. And as soon as the sun started to dip behind the treetops, the air got heavier. The temperature dropped faster than it should have. The forest fell still, like it was waiting on me. I told myself it was nothing. I've camped in dozens of states, and every place has its own rhythm. But the thing about fear, the real kind, is that it doesn't leap out at you. It builds itself under the surface, grain by grain, until it's solid enough to stand on. I grilled a small dinner outside, ran through the usual checks around the RV, and tried to convince myself to enjoy the solitude. But even then, something felt off. The trees around my site didn't sway the way they should in the breeze. The forest sounds, crickets, owls, rustling branches, they trickled in and out like I was hearing them through a wall of thick glass. But what really got me was the smell. Not a bad smell, not rot, not sewage, not anything natural. It was metallic, clean, sharp, like the air before lightning strikes. But there wasn't a storm anywhere near me. The sky was clear enough to see every star. That smell clung to the back of my throat, like it didn't want me to forget it was there. I tried to sleep early, but around 10, something tapped the side of my RV. Not a knock, not an animal scratching. A tap. Light, deliberate, like someone pressing a single finger against the aluminum siding. I froze in my bunk, listening. Another tap. Same place, same pressure. I sat up, heart pounding harder than it should have. I told myself it could have been anything. Branches settling, a squirrel, even thermal expansion. But I've camped long enough to know what random noise sounds like. This wasn't random. I waited 10 full minutes before I even breathed normally again. I finally turned on my small flashlight and stepped quietly to the nearest window. The forest was pitch black, more than normal, like the darkness had weight. The beam of my light stopped just shy of the tree line, swallowed up like it didn't matter. The metallic smell was stronger near the window, but nothing moved, nothing spoke, and nothing tapped again. I returned to bed, the unease tightening across my ribs. My mind kept circling the same question. Why would something tap just once? Why only twice? Why stop right when I went still? Things that want to get your attention usually keep trying. Things that are testing you don't. I didn't sleep much after that. Every shift of wind, every snap of a branch pulled me right back into a half-awake panic. By dawn, I felt like I'd survived something even though nothing had actually happened. That's the problem with the kind of fear North Carolina teaches you. It doesn't need events, it just needs space to grow. I made coffee, took a long walk around the site, checked the perimeter, no tracks, no disturbed branches, no sign of animals or people. Even the leaves near the RV looked untouched, flat, undisturbed. Too undisturbed. The day was calm, almost warm, but the air still tasted metallic. By late afternoon, I was trying to convince myself to move campsites. Nothing dramatic had happened, but my instincts were screaming in a way I hadn't felt since I was a kid. But pride is a stupid thing, and mine convinced me to stay one more night. I told myself that running from nothing would only make me paranoid, that fear needed evidence, that I wasn't the kind of man who bailed just because the dark felt heavier than usual. I should have left. As the sun lowered behind the pines, the quiet unease from the night before returned, decked but sharper this time. More intentional. The wind died again. The birds vanished. The trees stood still like they had all turned to stone. And just as the last light drained out of the clearing, I noticed something wrong with the shadows. They were too long. I don't mean late evening long. I mean long enough that they stretched past the trees, reaching toward my RV in thin, unnatural lines, like the forest was trying to claim something that didn't belong there. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me more out of instinct than reason. The silence wrapped around the RV, thick and absolute. Around 9, the tapping started again, this time from the back corner. Same exact rhythm. Tap, pause, tap, soft, deliberate. Too controlled to be an animal. I turned off every light, stood still, listened with everything I had. Another tap. But this one came from a different panel, lower, closer to the wheel well, and then finally something new. A sound I still can't shake. A slow, dragging movement brushing against the underside of the RV. Not scraping, not clawing, just moving, as if someone or something was pulling their palm lightly across the bottom of the chassis. Exploring. I crouched down, barely breathing, and put my ear against the floor. The vibration traveled through the frame like a whisper. That's when the metallic smell flooded the RV so strongly that my eyes watered. I should have driven out right then. I should have thrown the RV into gear, peeled out of that clearing, and never looked back. But fear does something strange to you when it's internal, when it's not about survival, but about truth. I'd spent years ignoring my own instincts, convincing myself that my gut was wrong, that my fear was exaggeration, that I could rationalize anything if I talked myself down long enough. And that night, a part of me wanted to be right more than it wanted to be safe. That's the poison of pride. I grabbed my flashlight, my boots, and my jacket. I unlocked the door as quietly as I could. The dragging sound stopped the instant my hand touched the doorknob. I stepped outside anyway. The air was colder than it should have been. The smell hit me so hard it felt like a chemical burn. The forest didn't move. The shadows didn't shorten. And the silence felt loaded. I crouched near the rear wheel well, shining the beam underneath. Nothing. Just flat ground, dead leaves, packed soil. But the soil, that part made my stomach drop. Something had smoothed it. A perfect, clean 12-inch swath of ground running the length of the RV's underside, like someone had dragged a heavy cloth or a bare hand along it. That was the moment I finally accepted that I wasn't imagining anything, that something was out there, that it wasn't an animal, and that it had gotten close enough to touch the one place I considered safe. I stood slowly, flashlight shaking in my hand. The forest around me felt too still, too aware, and then I heard it. A breath. Not mine. Not human. Low, wet, drawn out, coming from somewhere behind the trees. The metallic smell thickened, almost pulsing through the air, and something inside me, instinct, memory, something primal, finally snapped. I backed toward the RV, eyes locked on the tree line. The breath came again. Closer. Not fast, not hiding, just approaching, patient and confident, like it already knew I had nowhere to go. My hand hit the RV door. I didn't look back. I climbed in and slammed it behind me, but the breath didn't stop. It was right outside. And that's where I'll continue. The breath didn't stop. It pressed against the walls of the RV like a slow-moving tide of air, thick enough that it felt alive. I stood there in the dark, my hand still wrapped around the door handle, as if holding it would somehow keep everything outside from getting in. My heart slammed hard enough that each beat felt like it shook my ribs. But even through the panic, something else was creeping up inside me. A memory. A shape of a feeling I hadn't let myself touch in years. When I was 13, I went camping with my cousin near the same stretch of forest. Late at night, we heard something move around our tent. Slow, cautious, circling us. It never touched the canvas. It never made a sound beyond that careful, dragging shuffle. We didn't see anything when morning came, but the entire perimeter of the tent looked freshly cleaned, smoothed, as if something had brushed close the entire night. My cousin never camped again after that. I spent years pretending I didn't remember it. But standing there in my RV, breaths that weren't mine rolling against the walls, I felt the same cold bloom inside my chest. The body remembers fear long after the mind tries to bury it. I forced myself to step away from the door, but every inch felt like walking against a current. The smell, the metallic bite from before, thickened until it coated the back of my tongue. It felt like inhaling blood, even though I knew it wasn't. My flashlight sat on the counter where I dropped it earlier. I reached for it, but before my fingers touched it, the breath outside stopped. Not faded. Stopped. Silence poured into the space like water filling a container. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Nothing stood outside the window. No shadow passed by, but the silence wasn't absence. It was intent. I knew with absolute clarity that whatever was outside hadn't left. It was waiting for what I didn't know. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, maybe 3 minutes. Fear does strange things to time, before the temperature inside the RV started to drop. Not slowly, not naturally. It sank the way a curtain falls. Sudden, seamless, complete. In seconds, the air felt like winter. My breath fogged. The walls creaked. My instincts screamed at me to get behind the wheel and leave. But there was a problem, one I was trying desperately not to acknowledge. The RV keys weren't on the counter where I always left them. I stepped closer, sweeping the small space with my flashlight. No keys. Then I froze. The jacket I'd tossed on the small bench by the entryway wasn't where I'd left it. It was folded. Neatly. Precisely. Perfect corners, perfect symmetry, placed in the exact center of the bench as if someone had taken their time, long, careful time, arranging it. And on top of the folded jacket sat the keys. My throat tightened so fast it hurt. I hadn't folded that jacket. I always tossed it in a rush, meter, half on the bench, half on the floor. Something had come inside while I was outside checking under the RV. My skin crawled with the silent realization it wasn't just watching me from the woods. It was smarter than that, closer than that, more patient than that. I grabbed the keys, hands shaking, and stumbled into the driver's seat. My fingers fumbled with the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, it sounded like a lifeline. A single point of reality in a night that had twisted into something unrecognizable. I didn't waste time. I threw the RV into gear and lurched forward, tires spitting leaves. The forest swallowed my headlights instantly, but I kept driving, kept pushing through the narrow dirt trail that had brought me out there in the first place. I didn't dare look in the mirrors. The trees felt too close. The darkness too thick. My own reflection suddenly felt like something I might not trust. For nearly 2 miles, I drove through the twisting forest, branches scraping the sides of the RV, engine growling as I forced it over rocks and ruts. The metallic smell followed me for longer than it should have, clinging to my clothes, my skin, the steering wheel. But something else bothered me more. No matter how far I drove, the cold didn't leave. It sat in the cabin like a passenger. Eventually the trees thinned, the trail widened. I could finally see the gravel road that connected back to the main highway. A wave of relief washed through me. Shallow, temporary, but enough to loosen the tightness in my chest. I rolled onto the gravel, gaining speed, telling myself over and over that I was getting out, that I was leaving North Carolina behind for good this time, that whatever was back there didn't follow people once they reached the road. But fear, real fear, doesn't let you relax that easily. As the RV picked up speed, a rhythmic sound started underneath me, a soft thump, every 5 seconds, like something brushing the underside again. I gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles burned. Another thump, another, perfectly spaced, perfectly timed, not random, not desperate, pacing me. I pushed the accelerator harder, gravel spit behind me. The RV groaned under the strain. The thumps kept coming. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't want to stop. I wanted to keep driving until the fuel ran dry, but something in me broke. Maybe it was frustration, maybe terror, maybe exhaustion. I needed to know how close it was. I slammed the brakes. The RV jerked, tires skidding, dust exploding around me. The thumps stopped instantly. The silence afterward felt surgical. I sat still, listening, breathing hard. Then slowly, I leaned forward and looked into the rearview mirror. Not behind me, not at the forest, but down, at the gravel directly beneath the RV. The dust settled, and then I saw it. A long, smooth track underneath the RV, the same 12-inch wide, clean strip I'd seen back at the campsite, but now it stretched along the full length of the vehicle. Fresh. Perfect. Undisturbed except for the single set of prints beside it. Not animal prints, not boot prints, not anything I had a name for. Just shallow depressions, equally spaced, like someone had pressed a palm into the ground, pulled it back, moved forward, pressed again. But the spacing was wrong, too far apart for walking, too close for crawling, as if whatever moved didn't rely on bones or joints or weight the way we do. I couldn't breathe. My lungs refused. My throat locked. My headlights illuminated something else, something I didn't want to see. The gravel behind the RV hadn't just been flattened by tires and whatever had been under me. It had been disturbed in wide arcs, circular motions, like something had been pacing around the RV while I was driving, watching me, planning something. I didn't wait another second. I slammed the RV back into gear and tore down the gravel road, trying to outrun the image burned into my mind. The cold inside the cabin intensified, sinking deeper into my clothes, my skin, my bones. The metallic smell rose and fell like a living pulse. 10 minutes later, the cold finally began to fade. The smell eased. My breath stopped fogging, but my hands didn't stop shaking. By the time I reached the highway, I had convinced myself I was safe. Whatever was back there was tied to that forest, that clearing, that place. I wasn't there anymore. I was out. I told myself that, repeated it like a prayer. But as I merged onto the empty stretch of asphalt heading west, something happened that shattered any illusion of safety I had left. The lights inside the RV flickered once, just once. But in that moment, less than a second, I saw a shape in the reflection of the metal cabinet door behind the driver's seat. A silhouette, low to the ground, still, facing me. And then the lights steadied. The silhouette was gone, but the metallic smell returned, sharper than ever, and I knew with a clarity that made my skin crawl that getting out of the forest hadn't saved me. Something had come with me, something that didn't care about trees or roads or boundaries, something that had waited patiently and wasn't done yet.